Taken off my jacket, rolled up the sleeves, signal we were in a workshop, an informal environment. We have two meaty reports, including really 4 big questions that would change how we use our housing stock going forward. And so I guess, I know council's all had an opportunity to look through the advanced materials and stuff. You want us to deal with these one by one, in which case we may have to punt some to another night, or do you think that, you want to just do the first one, which I think has really the 3 questions in it, and how do you want to progress on this, I guess, at this point?
So you're suggesting we do just one of them tonight?
One at a time until we run out of time, or we could do our best to get all of them done.
Let's do one at a time.
Suite size and which 2 are you proposing we?
Well, the report order, I guess. But
Yeah.
Let's do one at a time. This is just too important to kind of get to the end of the evening.
Is that clear to staff? Then that we're going to try and just get them done one by one until we're tired.
Until we're tired. No, when we're tired, we seem tired. We need to not go any further because then we're not paying attention.
Thank you for that clarification.
Well, sometimes they want us to get tired.
Yeah, so the first report, obviously, the questions about secondary suites, infill housing, and short-term rentals. And I guess engagement approaches and another piece of short-term rentals.
So let's talk secondary suites today.
We're just going to do them one by one. So the first one, well, I'll just go to the staff presentation, but we'll pause when there's questions about the first area.
Perfect. Thanks so much. I'll just stand up for a couple minutes. I'm Tina Atfa. I'm the manager of community planning. Thanks for the time tonight for this double workshop. I'll introduce the project planners. Jessica Lee will be doing the first presentation. Ryan Gilmore will be doing the short-term rentals. I'd just like to also introduce Alexandra at the back, Brzozowski, our new housing planner who started with the district.
Hi.
So these are 2 items that are returning from council workshops and public engagement last year. So the planner will walk through some of those engagement findings and also set out some options as Mayor Little described. The options are meant to help us frame up the conversation and provide, seek your input on our next steps. There is a lot of content, I will say, as you will have noticed in the reports. I really would like to also point out what we heard summary. I hope people in the community who had a chance to look at it have found it easy to understand and digest. We've really taken the comments we've heard about being visual and graphic to heart. So I'd love to hear your comments on that. This attachment is in both reports and both presentations. All summarized in one document. And that's because last spring council directed us to do the engagement on all these topics. This is the report that summarizes that. There's a lot of content, as I said, but what we want to do is come back in a gradual way throughout the coming months and 2023, so that each item, rest assured, will have an opportunity for a more fulsome discussion. Today is a workshop to hear your thoughts on where we are today. Thank you. I will turn it over to Jessica for minutes. Did we develop the agenda?
He gets really lax in these rooms. He's tired.
All right. The agenda has been circulated in any errors or omissions. Hearing none. Moved by Councilor Murray, second by Councilor Forbes. Call the question. All those in favor, contrary minded, motion carried.
Somebody's paying attention.
Did we have minutes from? No minutes on this one. Yep. Thank you very much. Back to you, Ms. Atfa.
Thank you. I'll turn it over with your permission to Jessica Lee.
Thank you.
So good evening, Your Worship and members of council. My name is Jessica Lee, and I am a planner with the Community Planning Department. I'm here tonight to provide a brief presentation on the public engagement results for the housing options for single-family neighborhoods work that took place last spring, with a focus on what we heard about secondary suites and infill housing. Tonight, we will be also seeking council input on the options for next steps in advancing work on these 2 housing topics throughout the year. This presentation will take about 10 minutes. So increasing housing diversity has been identified in a number of the district's existing policies and recent initiatives. This includes the official community plan, the OCP action plan, the final report from the Rental, Social, and Affordable Housing Task Force, and our housing needs report. Last spring, council discussed options to increase both rental and homeownership options in the district's single-family neighborhoods and directed staff to proceed with engagement on secondary suites, infill housing, and short-term rentals. Public engagement took place in May and June and included a range of activities to obtain broad and diverse community feedback. The purpose of today's workshop is to share the engagement results for suites and infill housing and potential next steps for council's consideration. The results and next steps for short-term rentals will be discussed potentially later this evening. For suites, the focus of public engagement was to obtain the community's feedback on possible zoning changes to support more diverse sizes and enhance livability of basement suites. And for infill housing, we wanted to know the community's preferences and priorities for this type of housing, including where it should be located. Types of infill housing include coach houses and suites on the same lot, small lots, duplexes, triplexes, and multiplexes. So starting with secondary suites, we asked about maximum size to understand if the current regulations are too limiting. Currently, suites are restricted to about under 1,000 square feet, which is about the size of a 2-bedroom suite. What we heard was strong support for creating larger suites to accommodate families and greater diversity. We also asked the community about smaller suites and if there should be a minimum size. What we heard was support for a new minimum floor area requirement to ensure smaller suites are livable. Suites are often located in the basement, and we wanted to know the community's thoughts on encouraging more livable basement suites. What we heard was support for zoning regulations that create new suites that have greater access to natural light and connections to the outdoors. And lastly, we wanted to understand what barriers people face when considering or building a suite. What we heard was that costs, approval timelines, and parking requirements were main considerations. These are just some of the high-level findings, and more details of the engagement results can be found in the What We Heard report, which is attachment 1 in your agenda packages. So from the public engagement, we heard support for increasing maximum size and introducing a minimum size. Staff have identified 3 potential options for council's consideration, each with their own opportunities and considerations. Option A would be to increase the maximum size and introduce a minimum size. This has the potential to create larger rental options for families, ensure livable sizes, and provide flexibility to homeowners. However, one consideration is that a new minimum size may create a barrier for those who desire to build smaller suites. Option B would be to restrict the suite size to only a percentage of the single-family home, thereby not having any caps in floor area. Similar to option A, this could allow for larger suites and greater flexibility. However, a lack of specific floor area restrictions could create very large suites that might impact neighborhood character, and this option could still result in smaller suites that are considered unlivable. Staff are aware of several other municipalities that have adopted similar approaches to option A and B. This includes West Vancouver, New Westminster, Burnaby, and Coquitlam. If directed to proceed with either option, staff would bring forward recommended zoning bylaw amendments in the first quarter of 2023. Council may, though, however, direct staff to maintain the status quo. This would maintain the current maximum floor area and percentage regulations and continue to not restrict the size of smaller suites. For your mayor, did you want to discuss this first or continue?
One more on secondary suites.
Okay,
Is that
then we
right?
go to the next one. For improvements to livability of basement suites, we heard support for minor zoning changes. Staff have identified 3 potential options for next steps. Option A would be to increase building height for all new single-family buildings to accommodate less deep basement suites. This could increase natural light opportunities and may address environmental and construction issues associated with basements. However, the community did express concern regarding shadow and privacy impacts, and implementation would need to carefully consider the district's unique topography and interrelated zoning regulations. Additional community engagement and detailed analyses would be required under this option. Option B would be to expand localized depression regulations. And when we talk about localized depressions, we are referring to the pedestrian entrances to basements, such as shown on this slide up here. Expanding the allowable localized depression area could encourage larger entrances to basement suites and provide opportunities for natural light, private outdoor space, and greater accessibility. However, this option may not address environmental and construction issues associated with deep basements. The City of North Vancouver has undertaken initiatives similar to options A and B to improve basement suites. If directed to proceed with either option, staff could anticipate bringing forward proposed zoning bylaw amendments for council's consideration later this year. Council may also direct staff to undertake neither option and keep with the status quo or option C. This option would maintain the existing neighborhood character by not changing building heights, but would not address the livability concerns of deep basement suites expressed by the community.
Okay, so just on the question of secondary suites, so just on the first one, I support larger maximum size. Provincial government changed the regulation to allow up to 50% of the square footage to be assigned to a secondary suite. That makes sense to me. I think it was an arbitrary, I think it was 976 square feet or something like that before, and it seems arbitrary. You could have a 5,000 square foot house. Why would you limit the suite size to 900 square feet? You could make it dramatically bigger. So I would support up to 50% of the square footage being permitted in that. Can you just go to the
So if it was a 5,000 square foot house, you'd support a 2,500 square foot basement suite?
yeah, I don't see why not.
Usually 5,000 square feet is spread over on 2 floors.
I'm just saying, what interest is it of us to how they apportion the interior of the building? If it doesn't change the impact on the neighborhood, why do we care? Right? And so the provincial government has allowed us to go up to 50%. I think we should go up to 50%. On B and C on this, I didn't see, when I went and looked through this, I didn't see it as A or B. I saw them as two different very suites of options that you could pursue, but there's no reason you couldn't pursue both. In some cases, in this one, there's obviously a conflict because you're trying to actually decrease the size on it. So I didn't actually have a comment on B and C on this page, but on the livability one, I liked option A, and I don't see why that would collide with option B. So option A, height, my office deals with a lot of complaints about our stormwater management plan, largely because we're digging basements in everywhere and people are incentivized to do it. They get exempt space in the basement, and I think the only way to appropriately move out of the ground is to compensate with above ground massing, increase the height of the building, increase the massing of the building, and no longer give an exemption for basements in new buildings going forward. We're giving far too much of an incentive for people to change the hydrology of their entire neighborhood by putting huge tanked and pumped basements.
There goes your 2,500 square foot basement suite.
Well,
But just saying,
it's not.
we can argue about this tomorrow.
I said secondary suite, not basement suite, and you're going to see lots of buildings that actually the ground floor can be separated from the upper floor and has all the same services as the upper floor. So it wasn't a basement suite; it was a secondary suite. So I think that this is just inevitable. We have to go this direction where we're getting rid of the incentive to produce basements and instead produce more above ground massing to accommodate. So I'm wholeheartedly on A. B, I don't understand why that would be a conflict. Maybe I'm not understanding it correctly, but it would seem to me that you could do both, and that wouldn't actually be an issue. Am I misunderstanding? Is there a collision in there I'm not seeing?
Through your worship, we identified different options to understand where staff should focus our work. So if you think option A and option B is something we should proceed with together, it would take some more time. And
higher priority for me is A. Okay, Councillor Back.
Thank you, Your Worship. I tend to agree with your comments on both of these in terms of the on the right. Okay. In terms of the suite size, we are trying to create bigger suites for families to live in, and I think increasing the maximum size does make sense. I tend to agree with the mayor. I think it should be a percentage of the home, because it could be up to 50% of the home, and I don't see how that could, where the issue is there. In terms of the second piece, the roof height is a big one. I know in the city of North Vancouver, where you can have higher roof lines, it does create much brighter, more livable spaces. So I think that makes a lot of sense to go in that direction. I don't have as much of a comment about the localized depressions, but I think as long as there isn't a conflict there, then that could potentially create more outdoor space, which is obviously better for quality of life for anyone living in these suites. So I think that warrants attention as well. So I would say I support A and B on in terms of the livability.
That's Mary.
So on options for suite size, you know, I don't know who's going to be building a 2,500 square foot basement suite. That's going to be a large lot. I just always use personal examples. So I lived in a 4,700 square foot house on 3 levels. I had a I don't know what we call it, a partially submerged basement. So there was natural light that came into the downstairs all around the basement. It had it could have been a suite, it wasn't, but it had 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, a storage area, a little library area, and then a living room and a dining room with a depressed access. It was on a 12,000 square foot lot. And it was a absolutely completely suitable 2-bedroom basement suite, and it was not 2,500 square feet. Now, the neighbor around the corner had a 2,500 square foot basement with a 3-bedroom basement suite that was still only about 1,500 square feet, 2 bathrooms, dining room, living room, kitchen, and then an entire rec room with a spare bedroom and another bathroom for use for the upstairs family. I'm completely opposed to these subterranean basement suites that we're allowing within the existing zoning bylaw, where you have to look up to see the sky. I actually went and looked at a few of them. There's some up in Lynn Valley, and I was horrified that is what we were asking people to live in. There was an email that came in today about the egress in one of those buildings in a fire. It would be impossible to get through those grates if you were a young child. You wouldn't be able to lift them. I don't know actually why we even allow them. You know, I really think we need to look into that liability. And it's because they want to get the full height. So I'm completely in support of removing the exemption for basements. And I have been for a while. You know, all of this stuff is accommodated through good design. You know, spec developers, contractors, architects, they just need a set of rules and they can design around anything, right? It's just imagination. And so I just think that we need to lift these suites out of the ground and provide that light and better egress. So, you know, I think if you're going to be looking at a 3-story house, you're going to want to retain part of the basement for your family, and then you could still accommodate a basement suite or maybe a basement suite and maybe a business in part of your house, maybe a basement suite and maybe an Airbnb in part of your house. But we'll talk about that another time. You know, I think we need to understand, you know, what are we talking? Is it like a 5-foot increase on the height level to bring it out of the basement? Or is it a reduction of these huge ceiling heights in these big homes that we're looking at? You know, 10, what is an average ceiling height that's coming from a lot of these bigger houses that are being built? Are there 20-foot ceilings, I'm sure, in some of these houses? What's the average? Do we know?
They'd only have 20 feet if they had it as a mezzanine kind of setup, then we still have a peak eve height, peak roof height.
Yeah, but on some of these big houses, they do, right? Some of them are built like that.
You really have to minimize the other.
So
floors.
what's the average? Is it a 12? I'm looking at all these plans.
Lots of 10.
Come on, isn't this just sort of like, you know, like
Lots of
Nicola's looking at, you know, engineering stuff?
Lots of 10s.
So lots of 10s, some 12s. So, you know, I mean, there's
Number
got-
says 10.
10, so there's got to be a bit of a middle ground on some of this stuff, right? But certainly, yeah. And then again, you know, we've got people that are building less is more, right? Less is more, big, huge. I mean, you know, part of the problem with these big basements too is that they're developing lot line to lot line excavating, and then we're losing all of the environmental, you know, portions of the lot. That is a huge concern. So eliminating these limitless basements hopefully will help with that. And then, Mr. Stewart, I just connect what we're talking about here, and we start talking about stormwater. And we need to have a workshop about stormwater, and we need to connect all these things. Everything is connected, and we need to understand the connection of all of it. We do something over here in suites, it affects the stormwater. We do something, you know, on the other side, it affects the stormwater, it affects the canopy and the neighborhoods, right? So I hope that once we have all these individual workshops, we bring them all together and understand how they're all connected and how one impacts the other.
Okay, can I go to Councillor Hanson and come back if you want more?
Yeah.
Councillor Hanson.
Thank you.
You're learning.
That's
So smart. Good.
In a specific answer to the question about size of suites, I think the 49% makes a lot of sense. And if in fact there are people who want to dedicate large portions of their homes in that way, rental housing, that would seem to me to fulfill the mandates of the district. And I also agree that we ought to get rid of incentives to create the basements that been a fault really in our zoning for some time, and anything we can do to bring these basement suites above ground to make them more livable. If we're going to be encouraging them, they obviously would be beneficial if they're livable. I didn't quite understand the idea of the depression, but I guess that has to do with the amount of space that we allow for the entrance. Could somebody explain that perhaps a little? I did see the line in the report, but perhaps you could explain that a bit more.
Your Worship, so as you can see on this image, it's an example of a localized depression, and how we calculate the localized depression area is just the landing to the door. And currently right now it's restricted to 3 meters squared, or about 2.5 meters in width. So it's quite small and it's quite limiting currently. And it
So
doesn't.
the proposal would be that you'd have a bigger staircase, like a wider staircase, or?
It doesn't include the staircase, just the landing area that's flat. So right now 3 square meters isn't quite enough to support patio furniture or private outdoor space. And
I
so,
understand.
for example, the city of North Vancouver, they increased theirs to 18 square meters that's allowed to support more sunken patios and outdoor space for tenants.
Is that on a side yard?
No, so
Yeah.
this currently right now we do permit it in side yards, but for the city of North Vancouver, it could be, I don't know if they are permitted in side yards, but for example, it would be in their backyard.
So that could be the landing area, like at the top of the stairs would be.
At the bottom of the stairs.
Can you put patio furniture down there?
Well, the point of increasing it would be to accommodate more space for tenants that could be subterranean, just to improve basements.
Get beyond the stairwell. We're not talking about a stairwell. We're talking about the landing at the bottom of the stairwell being dramatically bigger.
Right.
I know, but isn't that impacting the lot line and the foliage and, you know, the environment when you're putting more concrete to build subterranean patios? I mean, if you live in a basement suite, you know, the understanding is that you've got a backyard and you get to use a bit of the backyard. I mean, most landlords would offer a portion of their yard to their tenants to be able to enjoy it, not in some subterranean well, right? You know, I mean, we're trying to reduce the impact on the side yard with the lot lines being excavated property line to property line, not make it, you know, more impactful with more concrete. So I hope we're always keeping the environment in mind when we talk about this kind of stuff, right?
Anyway, I'm not sure I have a thought on that. I'd have to give that. But I was drawn to the discussion about permitting and how we can make it easier for people to have basement suites, cost of permits, length of time to get permit approved. I mean, in my first council term brought a motion seeking the incentivization of basement suites, because it occurs to me that an awful lot of the housing that we potentially need in the district already exists, and it exists in buildings that are being underutilized. And I think if we could improve the customer service aspect, making it easier for people to get the permits to create basement suites, that would be a way that we could potentially create housing which is affordable and which has the benefit of already existing. So I did want to weigh in on that. Those would be my comments. Thank you.
I've actually got Councillor Maud and Councillor Pope.
Thank you. In terms of suite size, comments earlier about, the maximum should be a percentage. I was just wondering if you can help me understand. I know we want livability, but in some older homes, we might not be able to accommodate a minimum size. So I just wanted to better understand the thinking behind having a minimum size. And it's not really quite mentioned in here, the size that you were thinking.
Currently, we don't have a minimum size regulation, and with the market, suites or units could get smaller and smaller. And so just one consideration is to add a new minimum size. And that was supported through public engagement to ensure that they don't get smaller and smaller.
The closet like at Whistler.
What would be the rationale though? I mean, assuming that there's a willing
Someone that wants to
renter
rent.
and a willing landlord, and that's a price point that is affordable to a human being, why would we restrict that function of the market?
No, that is a consideration as well, and that was brought up in one of these lists. A minimum size may be creating a barrier for creating smaller suites. And engagement did identify the benefit of smaller suites for flexibility, people with different situations and abilities.
In some of the other municipalities, they're talking about lock-off suites that are quite small. So I want to balance that with having a place that, someone's going to be comfortable with, but also budget is consideration. So I'd like to have that considered. And also with some smaller homes, the basement, you don't have that 2,500 square foot option.
Mr. Milburn had a comment as well on the earlier.
Your worship, much of the conversation around secondary suites was around being able to limit the residents. Staff were concurring with the input we received from the public to ensure that there's sort of a minimum amount of space that meets the daily living needs of that individual at home. So that's where the recommendation is flowing from, as opposed to just a bedroom. We wanted to make sure there was enough space for that, sleeping, eating, toileting, all the various functions that go along with the suite. So that's where the recommendation comes from, and I think that continues to be staff's recommendation.
There are examples of like closets being used for.
This on that point, livability is one factor, but the other factor is also affordability, right? Like what can people afford? Like I don't want someone just to have a single room, but there are some smaller suites that it's a washroom and a counter for your microwave, right? So it's a thought.
I think it's probably also more to address extreme examples.
Yeah, like closets.
Where somebody's in really an unsupportable space. You also find sometimes, like I know we did international students for a number of years, and we only ever took 2, but we were constantly having people refer to us because our house was probably large enough for the 2. It wasn't actually that big of a deal in our house space, where kids were being taken out of places that had 5 international students and a suite and so there were. I'm not advocating for minimum suite sizes, but I could see there's a circumstance where if you're going to allow more than one suite into a house, or if you're going to allow a suite in a coach house or other kinds of things, that you may want to start talking about minimums in order to make sure that it doesn't become a bunkhouse.
Got it. And just to follow up on Councillor Hansen's point earlier about process, I did rent out our basement at one time. what I found was, getting the permits weren't an issue, but when I wanted to decommission, yeah,
Pull your stove out.
pull my stove out, cap it, and then have it inspected. I get it, I understand why, but it seems like a bit too much, but I just put it out there for consideration. If we're looking at process, we need to look at process to, get the suites, but also potentially when someone wants to decommission. So
Keep the kitchen.
because later on, I might want it back when my mom needs a suite, right? But then now I'm gotta deal with a capped,
It was a way to manage it in the early days when we were trying to regularize suites that had been built with, a carpenter on the weekend and not getting like registered plumbers and electricians. We had a fire in Norgate in the 1980s where somebody was living in a basement suite. It wasn't code and there was a death and they couldn't get out of the basement. And so that is why the district was one of the first municipalities in the region to, legalize. They were called illegal because they weren't to code, a lot of them. Some of them were, and some of them didn't go through the permit process, but they got, professionals to come in and do the work. So then they were called legal suites, and it was to make sure that they went through a process where there was safety as the priority.
that aside, it's the full cycle, if you want to decommission.
Yeah, so now it's changed and we can look at that again.
Totally agree with Councillor Ma on that. Councillor Pope.
Yes, actually, that was going to be my point about bringing up the minimum size as well. Thank you for raising it, Councillor Ma. I have a question for everyone in this room. What do you think was the size of my first condo in West Vancouver? Just take a wild guess, let's throw numbers out.
500 square feet.
650.
350. 350 square feet.
375.
Take my
Was it
answer.
livable?
It was fantastic.
Do you have a view?
I had a gorgeous view. And it was tiny and eventually I moved out, but it was my first place and it was fantastic. So as far as I'm concerned, we have to, as a society, get rid of this notion that small is unlivable. It's not, it can be gorgeous. And what they do with small places these days is incredible. So I hear what you're saying about, we don't want people living in broom closets, but at the same time, I do think, there's a lot of examples of incredible suites out there for 300 square feet.
Could you have gone smaller?
Probably,
Like,
no.
was that a good, like that? I've seen little houses on Beach Avenue and it's,
In terms of the minimum,
was that the minimum?
is that
Oh.
the correct minimum
Could you have
or?
gone smaller?
That was the smallest there, yeah.
No, but
No,
could
but-
you have lived in smaller?
Yeah, could you have, like,
No.
no, okay, so that was a perfect
For me,
size.
that was fine, but it's all about the layout.
Yeah, it is.
And what's
Design.
built in. So they have even better designs now, so I can see it going smaller now.
So not a substantive minimum, but if there was like a really extreme low minimum of 150
Yeah,
square
too
feet or
small.
something, then
Yeah,
that.
maybe 100, I don't know what that number is, but I just wanted you to be aware of it when you're having your planning discussions. And my second personal example in regards to keeping things above ground was an investment property I had in Nanaimo. And I built a basement suite in there, and Nanaimo had a bylaw that you had to be able to escape through the windows in the basement suite. And so everything I did in putting in the windows, this, that, and the other was all about a human being being able to get out. So we have that already. So,
It's just the subterranean ones, you have to climb up to the window.
oh, okay, whatever.
You're climbing up.
And I really agree with everything everyone else has said about increasing the maximum size. Absolutely, we should be incentivizing people to have more room in their homes and provide more housing, desperately needed housing for students and family members and everybody else. Thank you.
Yeah, Councillor Forbes first time, then Councillor Murray. Yeah.
Thank you. I agree with everything that's already been said. But some other issues I wanted to bring up reflected in this report, and I may bring them up later, but for the time being right now, we need to make it livable. I think going back in history, it became a sort of revenue source for people who had a house, and so the basement wasn't designed for renting out. It was designed for a sunken rec room kind of idea, or maybe storage, I don't know, but it wasn't designed, I don't think, for.
My dad grew up on one of the coal chutes.
There you go.
That's what the basement was. It was
Yeah.
the cellar and the coal chute.
My grandmother lived just on the other side on of the highway at Westview, and yeah, she had a whole coal thing there. When I was a little girl, I would come upstairs covered in black dust, and she'd go, no, no, no. Anyway, so I don't think, so we've evolved, and we need to make these livable, and we also need to get them out of the basement. I've never liked the idea that people can build a 5,000 square foot house and then turn around and have all that extra space. It doesn't count as a basement in the ground. So I've never liked that idea either. And that's led to a lot of issues that we've dealt with in the last council as well with the having to tier front yards or side yards or backyards, and then having huge walls put up to the next door neighbor because we've allowed that. So I agree with everything that's being said as far as the livability and everything else. And I'd like to also point out that just like purpose-built rentals, buildings that are already built are the most affordable place to find rental. And so we really have to make that an option to be able to put in with houses that are already there, not be quite as concerned as the new ones, because quite frankly, most of the people that I've spoken to that are recent new house builds, they're looking at their basement level, what they call their basement level, more as a revenue mortgage helper, and we're not looking at it as livability. So what's already there is where we're going to get the most bang for our buck, and we need to make that as we need to cut down the cost, and we need to cut down the time, and we need to be able to have a package to give to people that makes it simple for them to understand how to get where they want to go. Now, having said that, I have to ask a question of staff, because it's been mentioned by some counselors before. Is staff looking to the idea of, if we approve this kind of thing, or is staff looking down the road or thinking in terms of stratifying single family lots? Because that's a big concern of mine. And
Mr. Miller, Mr. Milburn.
Thank you, Worship. It's not a recommendation of staff at this time. It's primarily around increasing rental supply in the community and making more livable rental places. Stratification essentially creates the ability then to demise the space and then sell them as individual real estate pieces, which would seem to be inconsistent with that objective. So that's not staff's recommendation at this time.
at this time is the key phrase.
Well,
No, I'm just,
we take council's direction on.
yeah, I know. I'm just saying,
At this stage, it's not lawful to stratify a single family home.
no, no.
Is there a movement afoot to make that lawful?
That's what I'm,
Is that happening across the?
We can get into duplexes.
Well, that, yeah, effectively, you're talking about.
It depends on the community. Some communities, especially if they're looking for, getting in a resort style where they want to try to create those kind of individualized opportunities. Our current zoning bylaw wouldn't permit, lots of that dimension. So yes, it is not permitted right now, nor is it recommended or contemplated right now. But some communities do look at it.
Is it enabled by provincial legislation? Is it? Oh, okay.
just as an example, just talking about stratification. So, I mean, the city of North Vancouver had 4 houses up for sale on realtor.com down around 5th Street. And if you look at the cost of that house right now, it's roughly I've lost the second sheet. Anyway, the point I was trying to make is it becomes 3 times the price when you allow stratification. So it throws affordability out the
window,
door. So that I have a real concern about that, as well as what that may do to the environment when we put so much building, as Councillor Miri was saying also, cement and everything else. But we're taking away the landscaping, we're taking away the green space, we're taking away, we're creating possible nuisance in a neighborhood. And how do we enforce that? I mean, it's all good and well to pass a bylaw and say, okay, you can't do this, but then how do we enforce it? We have a problem because we have lack of staff. We don't enforce our current nuisance bylaw as effectively as some of the community would like us to do. So I'm concerned about all of those things going forward. And that's, well, one other question I just had to ask, and this may be related to capacity, I'm not sure. But when we do like the timing of this survey last year was May 30th to June 21st, I think, which is really bad timing in the sense that you're running into the summer months, and we brought this up in my first term. Look at when you're going to do surveys, look at when you're going to ask for information. And I don't think that was great timing. And then we go into the summer months, and then in the fall, we go into an election. So there's all kinds of varying interests that are going on when we're trying to get that information. So I'd really like us to pay more attention to when we go out to ask for that information. And
the only thing I'll say on that was the pop-up was on a beautiful sunny day, and the area was flooded with people. And so that's the trade-off as well. If you're going to do those kinds of pop-up engagements, they take advantage of a busy summer day in some locations. So.
Well, we didn't have pop-ups during the summer. This ended June 21st, I believe.
It was beautiful time then.
And that's great. But the point is, we need to do it to make, we don't schedule it around the weather. We schedule it also around when people can make it there. So, and this closed on June 21st. So there was no pop-ups after June 21st. So,
but that's when the school lets out, and that tends to be when we limit it to some degree.
Yeah, no, I'm just trying to make it as accessible as possible. The other problem I had, or concern I have, is that we're quoting all these, we're breaking these numbers down and giving percentages for these numbers, but we're only talking about a little over 700 responses in a district that has 90,000 people.
Not a
So
sample.
by the time
That's what a sample is.
It is.
I know, but that's so tiny.
it's so skewed, you can take statistics with that kind of thing, and the numbers will come out, the statistics will come out wrong.
So now we're questioning all the engagement work that was
No, I
done.
don't think we're questioning engagement. We're just pointing out that there's limits to
There's some
influence that can
So
be
you
brought.
two are like more experts than the experts in engagement?
I think
That's not what I said, Catherine. I'm pointing out that statistics can be skewed any way they want to be. And
Yes, when we use people who are experts.
Well, Councillor Forbes has the floor.
when you take a small percentage and you say 79, 80% agree, if it's 15 out of 16 people, you're not really getting a clear.
That wasn't the
It's
case.
still, I think
Yes,
it
it
is
is.
still
There is a
statistically
stat like
valid
that.
for a community our size though, but point taken, all you can do is make the option to engage available. Who chooses to participate, who chooses to get engaged in it, that's an entire matter, and you have very little control over that unless you're pumping a tremendous amount of resources into each one. But I found it fairly accessible. I wandered into the Lynn Valley Village. There were signs up, people all over the place. I went in, walked around the panels and boards, and I actually was very glad we were getting back in person with the engagement.
And I don't disagree with that. My concern is making sure that we get as much input as we can. That's my opinion.
But
And you need to think of that when you look at the percentages that are quoted. That's my point. So that's it for now.
Councillor Murray, a second time, and then I'll come to you, Councillor Hanson. Councillor Murray.
I was just looking at the 9.5-foot wide house in New York City that was listed for $4.5 million last year. It's the smallest brownstone. It's in Greenwich. And it's actually been recently relisted for 3.5 million, so it's a bit of a bargain now. It's got 5 bedrooms and 3 fireplaces, but I mean, I use the example on the Parkway at Beaufort and Mount Seymour Parkway, where a regular 50-foot lot was subdivided in the 1960s by a builder, and it was rebuilt 5 years ago, 2 houses, and the mayor could stretch his arms out and touch wall to wall. And those 2 properties on the corner of Mount Seymour Parkway at a light, there's a crosswalk right there. So there's a flashing light and it's a busy road. And they both sold for $1.8 million. So smaller does not mean cheaper or more affordable. I do support the minimum. I think it's an important part of it because we have had examples, and the recent one was the owner in the city of North Vancouver who didn't want to shut down her illegal rooming house, and she was renting closets out with beds in them to people for outrageous sums of money, and was actually jailed. I think she was charged and jailed because she would not stop. So we don't want to have those kinds of scenarios, and I think certainly a minimum should be required to be able to give a reasonable. I have a lock off. We have a place at Whistler, and there's a lock off downstairs, and it's big enough that we could put a couch and a little, one of those little portable kitchens, a fridge, and whatnot. And it's certainly not, so there is a minimum size to those lock offs. They've been around for a while. So I do also have a comment about the way that we're communicating and our community outreach. And of course, COVID was a problem. And, and what the other thing that's really changed on the North Shore is that we don't really have a regular paper that goes door to door. We used to have the North Shore News 3 times a week. It went to every door in the district on the North Shore. It went to every door on the North Shore. And now the vast majority of us never see it. It's in stands. It's never regularly delivered. I haven't had it in years. I have to pick it up at the gas station if I can even find that. And we're advertising in it. We're using it as a way to outreach, to get to people, and it's just not working. Pop-ups, I think they're an effective tool, but I agree that you have a contained audience between January 1st and May when it may stop raining. There's got to be a better way. We've got some, I know corporate services is looking at some new ways of new platforms that are available that we can really, put our resources into connecting with as many residents in the district and businesses as we can, so we can, on a regular basis, send them out information and they can take part in surveys rather than hoping that you're going to catch them on Facebook, hoping that you're going to catch them on Instagram, hoping that they're going to walk by and stop and engage. I just think that engagement and communication has been challenging in this municipality for a number of years, and it's not getting better. It's getting, the algorithms on Facebook. I mean, there's been so many times when I've seen a meeting that was happening and I got the message on Facebook 2 days after the meeting happened. Right. And we've all had that experience, right? Like, it's not an effective tool to try to bring people, to the hall or, a pop-up or anything like that. So I just think we need to spend some money and resources in and that's not for you guys. Like, we have a communications department that works for corporate communications, but everybody does their own in this municipality. Every department does their own communication, and it really needs to be coordinated. It needs to be better. We need to sort of do a complete revamp on how we're talking to our residents and how we want to engage them on a regular basis with all sorts of things, surveys, meetings, etc.
We're making very good progress on the
Yeah.
project.
We were.
Let's move on.
No, this is part of the discussion, which is the survey.
Discussion materials.
Yeah.
Just saying that we're now an hour in and we got one question. If I can go to Councillor Hanson.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to disappoint you, Mayor, a little, because I'm going to carry on the same theme. In
So
part,
disappointed.
in part because Councillor Pope directed what seemed to be something of a caustic remark in response to this issue being raised. And I just wanted, I'm not putting myself forward as a statistician. And I'm not putting myself forward as an expert, and I'm not even criticizing this data. All I'm saying is that when you look at a district with 90,000 souls, and you consider the fact that
17 people.
Well, in one case, but even with respect to the questionnaire data, 301 here, 266 there, 283 and so forth. I mean, these are.
And 10% was in the city.
And 10% are in the city. These are, and when I looked around at the characteristics too, there was a section at the back about the characteristics of the people who filled in these surveys. And anyway, it's not to say that this information is useful. And it's not to say that we're not guided by it and it's not valuable to us. But ultimately, this body, the 7 of us, have the obligation elected. We're vested in us by our elections to determine the will of the community, not this survey.
I think it's fair to point out that the obligation is on us to get people engaged and to have people respond and get as many opinions as we can. For 3 years, we worked on the official community plan from 2008 to 2011, countless engagements. And in the end, it was only about 2,400 quality engagements that we had during the course of it. And we pumped tens of thousands of dollars into the communications. It's just hard to get responses. All you can really do is create a welcoming environment and create as many opportunities for people to, but ultimately at the end of the day, it's a representative democracy. It's the people in this room that make the decision on that. No, I fully support staff taking out of that though, that we want to be creative in how we engage. We want to find people in more locations. We want to be cognizant of when we're on, we're not going to do a survey in Christmas week or, some other time where we're going to have a low response, but at the same time, getting out to groups that are not traditionally sought for their opinions is important as well. So.
But even like the times, 3 to 5, like people are picking up their kids, they're getting dinner ready, like it's, some of the time. So we have to think about that, right? When the time of year, the daytime, yeah.
Okay. I did, nope, that was Councillor Hanson, Councillor Pope.
I was next.
Sorry, Councillor Back, sorry.
I just wanted to point out that throughout the whole last term, we had these conversations where certain councillors were questioning that we weren't engaging enough and it was never the right time and we weren't reaching the right people. And I think we'll never be satisfied until we can accept statistically relevant information. And I think we're really doing a disservice to staff's work in this and the amount of effort that they did put in to what I think is a very extensive survey that's completely statistically relevant and it represents our community. So for you to just say, well, that doesn't really represent the district. It does. And there's overwhelming support for what we're proposing in here. So I think we need to get past this and realize that it does represent what our community's views are, the majority of whom are weighing in this way, and get going. We can sit around and talk about this like we did for the last 4 years, or we can actually move forward and make some progress this term. But we're not going to do it by questioning the time frame and whether or not it was summer or spring break or what have you. There's never going to be a perfect time to do this sort of work, but I do think this represents some really solid work in terms of getting our community's feedback and getting some of the voices that we don't hear. And to your point, Your Worship, we're never going to get a huge amount of people turning up for anything that we do. It's the reality of local government. It's not that exciting. And people are busy trying to put food on the table and trying to pick up their kids and just get on with their day-to-day life when that's never been more challenging. So I think staff have done a great job here, and I do accept this work in this survey. So I think we need to move on from this. I'm still speaking. I think the North Shore News, you can say, well, I don't get it. I do get the North Shore News more weeks than I don't. There are other ways that we can reach people. I work in the advertising field, so I'd say buy more advertising. But I think this is a fairly representative survey. So I just want to give it that credit that I think it deserves.
I don't think anyone's arguing.
Oh, you were saying it wasn't the sample
No,
size.
I'm just saying it doesn't.
So I've got Mr. Stewart making a comment, then I've got Councillor Pope making a comment. Councillor Murray's added her name to the list. Mr. Stewart.
I'll be very brief. I chaired a task force in the mid-70s, and we had the exact same discussions. And I think what's changed is we're aware of more different techniques to use, but we also have a lot of fatigue. If people don't have a vested interest in the topic, they don't want to talk to you. They don't want to hear from you. And that's the challenge we have, is to get people interested in some of this stuff.
Even if they don't. Councillor Pope.
I bring an area of expertise to the table, which is in communications. And I know from working at a number of organizations and working on websites and social media and advertising and everything else, what staff did here is very, very robust in terms of the engagement, and I commend them for it. It's thorough, it's robust, and it has tried to reach people on all different kinds of levels. And yes, at the end of the day, people just aren't that engaged unless they're pissed off. So that's the problem that we all deal with. But I have to say that I was so impressed with the results of these surveys and this engagement because it completely aligned with everything I heard when I was out campaigning. And the overwhelming support for increasing rental housing options through coach houses, secondary suites, and other methods. So I just concur with what Jordan said, and we can spend a lot of time sort of debating what people who are experts at this do every single day. And it is a complete waste of time. We need to move forward.
Councillor Forbes, I'd love to be able to move forward on this, but do you have further comments on?
Well, I would just like to say that I don't think Councillor Hanson nor myself, I really want to make this clear, are disparaging what.
No,
It's
totally
crazy listening to this stuff. It is crazy.
Yeah, I mean, you know, those kind of comments are easy to make. But that's not what Councillor Hanson and I said. And just one comment.
What I heard from both the groups talking about is we need to be more flexible in how we listen to people, and I'll say at the end of the day, whether you're going to bring your own preconceived bias to every discussion, we all have it. It's human nature. And when you see a tranche of data that disagrees with the feeling that you have, then you go, well, there's something wrong with the data. We all do it. But at the end of the day, this was a good opportunity. People came out, shared their opinions, but it's representative democracy. It doesn't matter what the survey said. At the end of the day, you have to come up with the decision yourself.
Well, and I would like to say as well that shouldn't stop us from always continuing to look at how we can engage the community more. We don't want a 26% turnout to the next election. And there are definitely people who contact me that figure the fix is in because our communication is broken with certain areas of the district, and they figure the fix is in, so they wash their hands of getting involved.
Can we move
So
on?
excuse me, I'm on the floor. Excuse me, I'm
on.
Councillor Pope,
Well,
I gave you all
honestly,
the time uninterrupted as well. So I would
So-
like to move along, though, yeah.
Yeah, and one other comment that I just want to make, excuse me?
We would like to move on, I think, is what I'm
That's
hearing.
really nice, but he's allowing me to have the
This-
floor, so you shouldn't be
Let us
talking.
speak, Councillor Forbes.
So one other point I'd like to make is I just had a conversation today with the North Shore News, because for a month I haven't gotten, and I always get my paper, but for a month I hadn't gotten my,
That wasn't me, Betty.
no, it wasn't you.
That wasn't me.
I hadn't got a paper, so I had asked, I phoned them the last 3 weeks and mentioned I hadn't got a paper. And they phoned me back today and I spoke to them, and they're telling me it's a capacity issue with them as well. Because they're telling me that an adult driver gets a delivery route of 1,000 houses, 1,000 drop-offs. Children get 100 drop-offs. And what they've had to do because of capacity is that they're having to reassign 1,000 house routes to their adult drivers, and there's just not enough of them, so they can't make it around. So that I think that's something else we have to consider when we're talking about advertising and we're fulfilling our legal regulations. We can't necessarily rely on that paper getting to all homes, even when the newspaper's trying.
So we have a legal obligation to conduct public hearings. All of these other things, it's our own efforts, our own decisions on how we're going to engage. Yeah, I just want to empower staff, be creative, but at the same time, flexible. I really like using the town centers, and I know we specifically were seeking advice on cycling initiatives and others, and we went to the trailheads. That makes absolute sense if you're trying to get specific information from a specific segment of the society. So I don't have an issue with that. We're all going to at times challenge the data because it doesn't line up, and we're going to have to move on.
I think the important point
hold
though,
on,
Mayor
Councillor
Little.
Mary, Councillor Mary, I am good. We have to move on, or we have to table this to another night. And so if we're not in the mood to carry on and keep this discussion going, then the matter gets punted to another time. I'd like to progress. And so, so can I go back, Mr. Stewart, did you have a
I
comment?
just, sometimes with workshops, everybody talks, says something a little bit different. If you need me to summarize what I think this group said as a consensus position, use that as direction, put that in the minutes, not a resolution. Then staff can use that to come back.
I'm happy to come back to you to sum up at the tail end, but at the same time, you know, the workshop, the purpose of it is to help staff so that what they put on the floor when we come back to a regular meeting of council, that it's got generally all the pieces we were talking about in it. And so that's the purpose of it. But so I'm looking back to staff. We've actually had a fair amount of feedback on the first couple of questions, I would say. Can we move on to the next questions?
So moving now on to what we heard about infill housing. We asked the community about their housing needs and preferences for single family neighborhoods generally. And increasing housing diversity was considered very important. And there was an identified need for more affordable alternatives to owning a single family home, more rental options generally, and more options for seniors to age in the same neighborhood. We also want to know what types of infill housing the community want to see more of and where. So what we heard was a desire for more one-story coach houses, duplexes, two-story coach houses, and suites and coach houses on the same plot. And there was support for locating those types throughout all neighborhoods in the district. Recognizing that infill would introduce new forms of housing and establish neighborhoods, we wanted to get some other communities' opinions and concerns. Highlighted benefits such as increased land use efficiency, reduced commutes, and greater opportunities for renting or multi-generational living. But the community also expressed concerns about loss of greenery, parking and traffic impacts, and increasing costs of living. So the district does not permit suites and coach houses on the same lots. However, from the public engagement, there was interest in this. There are 3 options that council could consider as next steps. Option A would be to allow suites and coach houses on the same lot where one-story coach houses are already permitted. This approach has the potential to increase rental options and would be relatively straightforward to implement in the zoning bylaw. But this option may have impacts on traffic, parking, and existing infrastructure that would need to be further reviewed. Option B would be similar to option A, but focused on specific areas only. An example would be lots that permit both one-story coach houses and are also located near transit or amenities. This has the opportunity to increase rental options as well, but further work would be required to identify these specific areas, and engagement in these specific neighborhoods would be necessary. There are several municipalities that have adopted similar approaches, including Vancouver, the City of North Vancouver, New Westminster, and Coquitlam. If directed to proceed with options A or B, further work would include additional evaluation of potential outcomes and review of off-street parking requirements. Staff anticipate bringing forward proposed zoning bylaw amendments for council's consideration in second quarter of 2023. Council may also direct staff to stick to the status quo, which is to maintain the current gradual entry approach to coach houses in the district. This would permit coach houses only where there is no existing secondary suite. In addition to coach houses and suites on the same lot, the community indicated a strong desire to see more 1- and 2-story coach houses generally. Currently, 2-story coach houses require a development variance permit be approved by council prior to building permit, while a 1-story coach house only requires a building permit. There exists an opportunity for the district to consider expediting the coach house approval process with 3 potential options. Option A would be to extend the building permit only process to include 2-story coach houses. This option could simplify the approval process for 2-story coach houses and could result in time and cost savings to the homeowner. However, one consideration to highlight is that the approval process would not take into account neighbor concerns or building design. Option B would be similar to our current process, but delegate development variance applications for 2-story coach houses to staff. This option could reduce approval timelines while still taking into account neighborhood feedback and building design. Since staff review would still be necessary, the approval process would not be as streamlined as option A. North Vancouver, West Vancouver, and Vancouver are some municipalities that have similarly streamlined their coach house approval processes to delegate approval authority to staff or directly to building permit. If directed to proceed with options A or B, staff would conduct detailed review of current approval processes, undertake additional engagement as necessary, and report back to council with refined options at a workshop later this year. Council may also direct staff to stick with the status quo and our current process. One-story coach houses would, in this case, still require a building permit, and development variance applications for two-story coach houses would still be considered by council on a case-by-case basis. Further, our future work plans would also include exploring other infill housing types in the district, including small lots, duplexes, triplexes, and multiplexes. There are 3 high-level options to consider. Option A would be to explore a district-wide approach to expanding these infill housing types. This option is expected to result in a gradual pace of change across the district as determined by the market. However, engagement results indicated concerns regarding loss of greenery and potential impacts to traffic and infrastructure would need to be reviewed. Option B would be to explore an area-specific approach to expanding infill housing. This option may have lesser impacts than those in option A, but by focusing infill housing in select areas only, speculation and faster change could occur in these areas. Municipalities such as Victoria, Coquitlam, and Vancouver are undertaking initiatives to explore infill housing or missing middle housing. Both options A and B would involve further engagement and council input over time as staff further refine options and review feasibility. Staff will present refined approaches and a public engagement strategy to council at a workshop later this year as well. Option C would be to not proceed with expanding infill housing options at this time. So the next steps and approximate timelines for reporting back on suites, coach houses, and other infill housing types are shown on the screen. The approximate timelines are based on available resources and taking into account the additional work necessary to develop and prepare bylaw amendments or refined options. Some of these next steps will be initiated in 2023 and will carry into 2024. So this concludes this presentation and portion on infill housing, and staff again are available to answer.
Thank you very much. Yeah, just my own comments on it. I'm open to coach houses with a suite, as long as it fits within the gross floor area of the building, including the massing of both. So if somebody has excess square footage, then they can do either or both. I don't have an issue with that. I still think that council needs to retain management of one-story coach houses.
Two-story.
Correct. That we don't automatically delegate the authority on two-story coach houses to staff. The reason is expectations of privacy in backyards. Where there's a lane, maybe I'd be open to a two-story being through some alternative approval process, but when it's overlooking into the backyard of someone else's, I think that, you know, it infringes on peaceful enjoyment of someone's property. And so I'm not a big fan of it in that case, and would prefer to keep the one-story coach houses. On the infill question, we've done some area-specific infill proposals, and they're really contentious in the community. Like the one in Clement above Mount Royal, all it ended up being was a huge neighbor-to-neighbor fight over it. As you saw, some people very financially motivated to subdivide their property, and other people who just wanted the neighborhood to generally be left alone. And like it really was an intense neighbor-to-neighbor battle that was occurring out of that. For marginal improvement, it produced like 4 or 5 new units. We approve, you know, multifamily complexes with 200, 400, 700 units. And so the disruption to the community for infill into some of those outer areas, I just didn't think was worth it. I think we're better off to build multifamily in our town centers than we were to be building infill. It just, the calculus didn't work for me. So I'm between B and C on the infill option. You know, if there's a neighborhood that really makes sense, it's an area that's on the fringe of a town center, maybe we need to talk about it as a densification or infill area. Clement really wasn't, and so it really became a conflict. But if you did it on the edge of, you know, perhaps the Lynn Valley Town Center or the Sealand development or others, maybe it would be less contentious, and then I'd tend to be more of a B than a C. But yeah, no, I still concerned about second story coach houses, totally flexible on secondary suites with a coach house. Yeah, Jim. Oh, sorry, I actually took Councilor Murray, then you. Yep.
So I'm supportive of allowing a suite and a coach house on the same lot. I'm just curious, how many coach houses how many single family or single story coach houses have been approved? Since we, the numbers. Single story.
We have 8 coach houses that were approved through the building permit process. So I assume those are 1 stories.
Right. So, and then 32 in total. So, you know, when coach houses first came in, you know, years ago, because there's lots of them in Vancouver, right? You know, they were, you know, not quite as fancy as they are today. And maybe they could have been a bit of a revenue generator. But when we started this process at $250,000 a pop for a single story coach house, and now upwards over $350,000 because you are requiring, you know, utilities to be brought in and excavation and parking and all those other things. It's not a revenue generator. It's not providing revenue for those with big mortgages. It is a way to create housing for families, right? To offer the parents to be able to live on the property. And I think that example just off of Keith Road that we talked about, and I hope engineering is going to be bringing forward some level of amendment to be able to allow the front driveways to be retained as opposed to having to decommission them, especially if we're adding more people to a property. Why would we require the front driveways to be
Stay on target.
Well, I'm just talking about this in general, right? No,
It's another barrier to get.
well, it is, it's just a cost that you don't have to incur for some ridiculous policy that's been implemented for all these years. We don't need to include it. So allow suites and coach houses on the same lot. I'm okay with that. I looked at the last 4 2-story coach houses that came to council for variances, and we did approve all of them, but they were all on a lane, and 2 of them were depressed into a hill. So the impact to the neighbor was less, and there was comment from the neighbors, and there was a back and forth. So I'm totally with the mayor. We've had coach houses when we first started talking about it. Whole wars erupted. We had one in Capilano on a very odd shaped corner lot where all the neighbors, in some houses in the district, we're not a grid. You know, one size does not fit all. You know, when I lived on Seymour Boulevard, I bordered 5 houses. 5 houses sat on my fence line because of the way the lots were cut. You know, we've got panhandle lots, we've got lots with weird corners on them, nothing square, you know, we have lots that are not square. So, you know, when we're talking about a 10,000 or 15,000, 20,000 square foot lot, and you've got, even on my old lot, 12,000 square feet, if I were to put in a coach house in my backyard, it would have impacted 3 houses with, you know, a look over. So I think it is important. I think we could consider ones on lanes, and ones that, because we haven't depressed a lot of them into the slope. I think there could be some discussion about that. But I think for the ones that are landlocked or neighborhoods, you still have to be able to give the neighbors an opportunity to discuss. Coach houses are not affordable. Infill housing, we had half the neighborhood of Upper Capilano absolutely opposed. And we had the other half of Upper Capilano, or a street in favor because of more speculation of buying houses, being able to cut to properties and then sell them for $2 million. Again, the size does not matter. Smaller doesn't mean more affordable. Cutting a lot in half in this community on the North Shore does not mean you are going to get, in fact, you're probably gonna pay more. So I think we're much better off at looking at some areas for duplexes where it's appropriate. I know the city has a lot of them on Keith Road. That's sort of where their duplex row is. And I think duplexes could be, well, there's some in there, right? I think it certainly could be more supported in areas that are close to transit and in closer to the town centers. But I think the other thing that we need to remember when we went through the pandemic, that those backyards and that land was awfully handy for growing food and playing in and having some space outside. And even our new builds that we're seeing in the municipality, there's a lot of concrete. There's not a lot of green space. We've got artificial turf popping up everywhere on real estate ads saying maintenance-free yard, artificial turf that's just going to be thrown into the landfill. I mean, we've really got to start thinking about what we're actually achieving with some of our zoning policies and what we want to sort of, you know, be at the end of the day. We were a mix between the city and the district, or the city and district of West Van at one point in our existence, and now I think we're all the same. And I think that's a loss for the people of the North Shore. We've gentrified this community and it's a very expensive place to live. And, you know, the city of North Vancouver just finished a rental building in Lower Lonsdale and a bachelor is $2,750 for a bachelor. And that's not helping. Two of the most affordable housing units down the street on Lonsdale, just above the highway, were two of the oldest buildings probably in that neighborhood, and now they're two luxury condominium units. I think I think we should be putting our resources, and you talked about in your presentation that this is, you know, there's some resource issues with doing all of this work too. I think we should put some resources into looking at our standard of maintenance bylaw and making sure that these affordable buildings that we've got that are left stay standing so we can still support that part of our community that we absolutely are critically needing to be able to support our businesses, our hospitals, our schools, and put the energy into that instead of, you know, more development, which is, I seem to think that that's all we focus on. There's a whole bunch of things that we've left off to the side, so.
I'd like to move on to Councillor Hanson if I can.
Thank you very much, Mary Lou. I'll keep myself strictly focused on the issue. With the introduction that I'm not guiding myself solely by the data that was collected in this report, but I'm bringing to this table my perceptions as to the values and priorities of this community. With that as a preface, I support allowing both suites and village houses. There may be some requirements for the lots that enable that, but I think we should set those requirements and then operate within them. I support a streamlined approval process for coach houses, which would include two-story coach houses. And I would support developing a set of criteria whereby those can be approved on a building permit basis. I believe we've had enough discussion of coach houses as they've come before us over the last 8 years to do that. I also believe that our community probably supports infill housing, small lots, duplexes, triplexes, quadruplexes. I would support it on a district-wide basis with the caveat that we're going to have to determine the criteria for that, the nature of the lots, the nature of the transportation amenities that are required, parking and so forth. But we should set the criteria and create enough opportunities for people to create smaller lots, duplexes, triplexes, quadruplexes, that we do in fact increase the supply of housing in the district, because I think that is an important vehicle for increasing the supply of increasing the number of homes. So those are my comments.
Any other speakers? Councillor Beck?
Thank you. I tend to agree with Councillor Hanson. I appreciate his clear position on that. I would say option A across the board as well. I think having a suite and a coach house on the same lot is something that has largely been supported. It's been happening in the city of North Vancouver for many, many years. And I think we can expand the permit, building permit only for 2-story coach houses, given the right set of criteria that's in place based on what we've seen come to council with in terms of variances. And I think exploring a district-wide approach to other forms of housing is something that we need to be doing as we look to kind of create a community that people can afford to live in for generations to come. And the sort of pace of change is not going to happen overnight. It's going to be over the course of many, many years. We're not going to all of a sudden see single-family neighborhoods disappear. In fact, what we'll see is gradually more people being able to live in those neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods becoming more of having more community feel and vibrancy again. So as I say, I'm supportive of that type of infill housing as well.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Ma.
First, I want to recognize the good work done by the staff. It's a complex issue. There's a lot of interrelated challenges. In terms of infill housing, I think it's part of the solution to the housing crisis, but it will take time for it to make a significant impact. I think Councillor Pope and I were at a session downtown that talked about the time that it takes for infill housing to really make a difference. It's going to be a while. Although I want to kind of encourage a sense of urgency in moving on these, I do support the overall timelines and next steps that are proposed. But hopefully done with a sense of urgency. And in terms of the different options that we would take in terms of coach houses and suites on a single lot, option A. In terms of coach house approval process, I do want to simplify processes. So option A. One where I think we might want to take a little look at, your option A is quite bold, and I like that, but I would probably support more option B on that one. So those are my thoughts. The last one in terms of small lots for duplex, triplexes, and multiplexes, I think there still needs to be a role for us to kind of take a look at it in specific areas.
And just the only comment again, we approved 1,600 units in multifamily developments last year. Coach houses, was it 4? It's not going to be a significant source of housing. A significant source of housing is going to be where you have the transit, where you have the services in place, where we already have the OCP capacity in place. And so we're focusing on infill to be a source of future housing. It's always going to be a tiny, tiny percent of the future housing in our community. Councillor Pope.
Tiny but mighty. I think that, actually it may not hugely impact statistically the amount of extra housing we put in, but for the people that want their parents to live on their property with them, or the people that want their kids to live on the property, many of whom I met when I was out door knocking, it makes an absolute world of difference to their lives because, again, many people cannot afford to live in North Van, and this would enable them to bring their parents in to live on the same land, or their family members or anybody else who can't afford to live in North Van. It opens up options for them. And I believe that one of the reasons we haven't seen that many applications for it is because we make it too hard for them. They have to go, and that's what we saw in the survey. That was reflected in the survey results, that was one of the biggest concerns people had, and one of the biggest barriers developers had to moving forward with this kind of housing style. And so I'm all in favor of anything that streamlines the approval process. I really like what Kelowna recently did with, and I've mentioned this to planning, and I see that I think it's covered in your needing to update the how-to guide to build a coach house. I think that's potentially could be in there, but Kelowna, for example, had a contest to pick 3 options for coach houses, and And they went through a big process with it all and finally came out with the 3 winners. And those 3 styles of coach houses are now their templates for all coach houses in Kelowna. And it's been, as far as I know, really well received, and it really speeds up the process, which is just, you know, another idea that other districts are doing. Victoria, you mentioned they have not quite, thank you for your presentation, by the way, I really appreciated that. Victoria actually has just passed, I believe, a bylaw that they can allow up to 6 units on a single family piece of property. So other districts are moving ahead. If we don't place value in what our own community has been saying during the engagement process, then I think we only have to look to other districts to see how much further ahead they are on this than we are. And we know we're behind, and we know we need to move more quickly to address the housing crisis. I don't think that's in dispute at all. So I'm all in favor of exploring a district-wide approach to infill housing. I think it's super important that that we reduce the barriers to people who want to have this type of housing on their properties. And that means giving more, I'm not quite sure what option it is, but it's basically giving staff more leeway and control over the processing of all of these details that seem to bog this council down. And I think this could be really quite helpful to improving life for our North Vancouver community.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Miri.
I was just going to point out, I'm just looking at some of the duplexes that have been built on East 4th, East 5th, new ones. 22nd Canfield Crescent, although I don't actually think that's a duplex. And then an older one. The older one on West 5th in the city of North Vancouver, 10 beds, 6 baths, is for $3.98 million.
A duplex.
Yeah. The new duplexes on Keith Road on East 4th and 8th East 5th average $2.4 million.
At one side or?
That's just one side. Yeah, that's not both. So, you know, we've really got to start understanding the value of land and what it is about. It is about money. It's about business. It's about investment. I talked to a builder actually the other day who said building a duplex or triplex is completely unaffordable right now because you have to build all the walls. Yeah, it costs them way too much money in their construction costs. That is this type of housing is not doing anything to help the housing crisis. Nothing. The people that are in housing crisis are those that are living in rentals because they can be sold to build duplexes. I'm living in a rental right now in a house up in Blue Ridge, paying over $4,000 a month for 3 bedrooms. It's a house that has not been maintained over the last 40 years. I have some broken windows. You know, it was a house that I needed to take because there wasn't a lot out there. And the property owner is, you know, it's a lot of money to be able to look after houses. Just getting windows is challenging. And so if a property was ever sold, you know, I'm out of luck. You know, Kelly was a renter at Emery and was displaced. A lot of people, we know people actually, Asherat that we talked about down on Marie Place has now gone into another apartment that is going to be torn down in a year in the city of North Vancouver. So she will again find herself in a displacement.
She got a place, that's great.
But for 1 year, and then she'll be displaced again. So I really think, you know, I keep going back to these discussions that we're going to have in these workshops about our priorities. I just don't know that prioritizing staff time that's so limited right now to focus on duplexes that are worth $2.3 million, no matter where you put them in the district, I don't care where it is, they're going to be worth that much money, is the priority when we're talking about people living in rental units that are all on the table for redevelopment. The apartment buildings up in Lynn Valley, those old ones that are affordable, that we've got families living in, and some have been living in them for 40 years, they are going to be displaced because those buildings have been already sold to developers, and they're waiting for the market to change to look at redeveloping them. Selling older houses that are rentals, like the one I'm in right now, if it was sold, gone. So we have to reprioritize what we're talking about here. And when we talk about crisis, it can't just be about every form of housing. Because for people that are building these kinds of homes, they're not in crisis. And people that are buying these kinds of homes, they are not in crisis. But every renter in this community, in an older building or in an older house, when the market shoots up again, those are the ones that are in crisis.
I don't have any other further speakers on the matter. Okay, so that's it for the first report. There is a second report. We've all had a very long day. I started meetings at 8:30 this morning. Are you okay? Like, I know we've expressed frustration that we haven't advanced on Airbnbs. Here we are on the brink of talking about
We're going to the
Airbnbs.
next meeting.
We're gonna put
We
it
have to be
next.
fresh and feisty. A lot of questions, and we're gonna battle the mayor about speaking
I want
time.
to make sure I got a consensus generally on that. Mr. Stewart, I'm going to turn that over to you. You've heard a lot of conversation. I think staff heard consensus on a number of issues
Yeah,
actually tonight.
Totally.
So, but I'll give it to you to recap.
Should be good. I heard that there's a recognition of balancing, and I'm talking about the very first one, the secondary street, balancing livability and affordability. But there seems to be some support for minimums, but they have to be reasonable. I don't think that makes sense. Support that livability. Seem to be support for maximum, which is a percentage of the size of the house, but also for eliminating basement exemptions. You want to raise suites, but you're not sure how you're going to do it. You don't want to see gross increases in roof heights, but you want staff to explore how we can get basement suites up so they have more air and they get access to light, and come back with sort of some reasonable mix as to what I accept in terms of raising the heights of roofs, balancing that off against 10-foot stories on. That's what I've heard.
Good.
All right. Thank you. I just realized that there's something has possibly been left out, which is about the parking, because the parking seems to be an ongoing irritant to anyone who has concerns about it. And I'm hoping that what we can do during this process is perhaps, look at the way we've written some of our bylaws for parking. As an example, that recent home that we found out that all the parking was being diverted to the back, when in fact he was quite happy to keep his driveway in the front and have cars in the front. So I think little things like that could make a huge difference for neighbors that are worried about increased parking. And I just wondered if that was
Parking needs to totally be in there.
Yeah, so that's kind of a mix of engineering requirements. So we can explore that, because I'm hearing that we can't be so rigid, because especially it being rigid, it forces secondary suites or hotels not to go ahead.
Yeah.
We're kind of losing out there. But if there is available room on the lot to park those cars without them spilling over the street, then that's probably what we need to look at our standards.
And so when you're the renter in a basement suite of a house, it's very hard to get into a battle with your landlord over which parking spot is yours. We may require them to produce one and set one aside, but overwhelmingly out there, they're not reserved for the occupants of the basement suite. The basement suite dweller has to park across the street, 2 blocks away, in other places, even though we've set aside that space for their purposes, because there's no ability to police it. And as the renter, you don't want to raise the fight, because they hold the ultimate hammer.
You're so lucky to have a rental in the first place.
But the demand is such, that's right. And the landlord can rent it out at market the next day if there is a disagreement on those kinds of things. And that's, so parking, I think you covered it very well, Mr. Stewart. Wherever we can park vehicles on private property, that is always preferential to relying on public property for parking.
Can I just add one thing into that is going to become an issue, but exists as an issue right now? There are some stratas that have rules about their parking within their strata boundaries. And when that is restricted, those cars are going to go out into the neighborhoods and park on those streets, further impacting parking availability for houses with coach houses or suites, et cetera. So all of those things we need to, consider. We can't look at any of this in a bubble or in a silo. It all has to be connected.
Well, the garage is being converted over to
Totally.
to office space and
Right.
secondary suite additional rooms that now the street is full. Sorry, back to you, Mr. Stewart.
No, I'm just, again, I'm trying to capture some of the trends of the conversation. I think that it's pretty well unanimous support for both coach houses, and secondary suites. There is, I think, unanimous process to say that we've got to streamline processes, but there's a little concern that some of these might not work well in the neighborhood. And so there may be a need, if we were to streamline it with the building permit, there may need to be some requirements in there. If, for example, we have some controversy, it comes up to council. Those are just picking up with staff. I hear there's sort of support for infill in principle, but there's a concern that where it would go and what it does to the community and the neighborhood. And so I think that tells me that there's just more work to be done on that as to how that would work before we actually come back to council and say that's a trend that we're gonna go after. Because if it is very expensive, it's not achieving necessarily duplexes. Maybe better with fourplexes, but duplexes may not give you the bang for your buck. And I did hear, and this isn't related to the presentation, but focusing all on adding units without protecting the older units may not be the right strategy.
We need to have a workshop on that actually to talk about standard maintenance and older units and older housing stock. We have our new housing guru that's going to look into all of these things. And we talk about housing generally, but we need to really specific and look at those older affordable units, how many we have, how many are under development threat, what we're gonna lose, what we've already lost, net increases, net losses.
Absolutely right. I gotta stick to single family, but I absolutely hear you
All connected.
on that.
Can I just add something to that? I'm very concerned when I hear the words, we need to do more work on it. I think that this staff has been working very hard on trying to create solutions to the housing crisis. And when we spend more time talking about it, engaging with people, this, that, and the other, we're just making a housing crisis worse. And desperate people become more desperate. And we want to have, to link it to the business development case, we want to have 36,000 jobs here by 2030. Well, how are we going to do that if nobody can afford to live here? We won't. So I would strongly urge us to resist holding back.
Where there's consensus, move fast. Where there isn't consensus, parse the issue up so that we can figure out if there's sub areas where we can get consensus. But at the end of the day, you're not always going to get consensus on it because there are obviously different priorities that we all bring to the table.
But do we have to delay, like, for example, the whole package of coach houses because we need specifics on certain areas? Like, can we move forward with part of it quickly rather than, rather than coming back and doing a ton more work and research and engagement and with a huge package of options?
But you're allowed to build coach house right now. We've built
I
32 of them.
know, but it's too hard, right? Because, as I said earlier, it's too hard right now for people to do it.
But it's also very expensive.
I don't know that there's quite consensus on council around infill right now. I think we need to define it, parse it out, and come back to you with areas. And that's not the same as a deep dive on infill. That's just saying, okay, we think if we were gonna allow this, it might look like this in these areas. That would work for you, council. We can do that pretty quickly. You know, trying to streamline the process for the coach houses, I think that's something that certainly we can do. Yeah, that's at this point, that's what I would suggest for.
We've got about 10 minutes left. We have some members of the public have been here again. We leave the public input to the tail end of the meeting. What have we missed is what we're looking for. Fresh eyes, not in the bubble of culture necessarily. Kelly, I saw your hand up. I see Lyle's hand up. So Kelly, you have 3 minutes for the.
I do. I just have a couple of little points that haven't been addressed. We've heard the comments over and over again. Coach houses are very expensive to build, and we heard also Councillor Pope say that she could live in a 365 square foot home. So one of the things we focused on in the renting and affordable housing task force was micro homes and tiny homes, and I haven't heard that factored into the conversation at all. So we were hoping, one of our hopes was that the bylaws could be amended, that a coach house could in fact, instead of a large home in that backyard, a tiny home. So if council could consider directing staff to, in that regard, that would be great. That's all.
Based on the council workshop night, it's all very interesting, and I heard a lot of interesting ideas here. But in terms of bang for the buck, I really think you're completely off the mark. One thing I would urge councillors, especially Councillor Murray and the mayor, who were both heavily involved in this one at the time, or look back on the public hearing and all the public meetings that went to branches. That was all about standards of maintenance. In 18 months, you went from 2 engineers' reports, one that was a 4-year-old complex, good repair. 18 months later, a second engineering report came out saying it's a tear down. It can't be torn down fast enough. That was an engineered rebuild. Buildings don't break down that much. My daughter lives in the UK.
Yeah.
She lived in an 80-year-old apartment building. During the past summer, she and her boyfriend bought a row house. It's 160 years old. It was built at the time of Charles Dickens, for heaven's sakes. And inside, I've never been there yet. I will eventually. I've seen the photographs. It looks great. Bottom line is, when it comes to standards of maintenance, doing a good job on that gives you far more bang for the buck than all these other housing options that will never be more than 1 or 2% of the whole.
Thanks. No, and branches was a tricky one because they got a leak in the summertime in the pool, and the pool drained out. And then in the fall, the high water table came back in and it lifted the empty pool up out of the ground. But nobody wanted to complain about it because they knew they were getting a great monthly rental rate, and they didn't want to have their rents go up to address it, because it was before the time of the rental caps. It was it's completely the prerogative of the strata to raise your rental rates to repair the flooded basement, the destroyed pool. They also lost their closets, like the storage units. The storage units also were perpetually flooded, and but nobody wanted to complain about it and activate the standards of maintenance bylaw because it was the most cost-effective in the area. And so, but that's multifamily. Today we're talking about single family. And
I know what I'm saying though is that was functionally
absolutely
engineered tear down.
Yep, that's right.
And it was purely done for the almighty buck.
And in the end, it produced our first purpose-built rental housing in the district of North Vancouver in 17 years. So there's an upside to that one too.
But it's expensive.
The other challenge, this is more for the new councillors. When we talk about standard of maintenance, that usually is dealing with health and safety and like kind of stuff. It is not dealing with when you take care of the plumbing, the siding and all the rest. That's the challenge. The current legislation doesn't give us the kind of tools.
That's what we need to change.
On
We need
mold,
to change
and
that.
hammer, but on well, sorry, you no longer have a storage unit. Less effective. Okay. All right, well, and I think that's enough tonight. So we'll move Airbnbs to the next date. You have a date in mind, Mr. Clerk, as to when that's likely to come back?
I think we need to discuss that amongst the
Okay.
executive tomorrow. We've got some ideas.
We'll do our job to get it in as soon as reasonably practicable, depending on, we also have some very busy nights like that. I tabled that item onto the 27th, and then I'm looking at the 27th, and it looks like it's a very full night already, so we'll do our best to rearrange the 27th to make that work, but technically, since we tabled it, it should actually be the first item of business on the 27th, right?
We'll get on the 27th.
Move adjournment.
Thank you so much. I accept adjournment. Thank you all for your patience tonight and staff for all the preparation and the reports. We do appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Yeah.